The earliest known written reference to the Finnish people dates from the 1st century CE when Roman historian Tacitus wrote, "The Finns are extremely wild and live in abject poverty. They have no arms, no horses, no dwellings. They live on herbs, they clothe themselves in skins, and they sleep on the ground. Their only resources are their arrows, which for the lack of iron are tipped with bone." Jumping ahead 2 millennia, we pick up our story in the mid-19th century on the eve of a devastating famine known as the Great Hunger Years that struck Finland in 1867 and 1868. An estimated 1 in every 5 Finns died of starvation in one of the greatest natural famines in European history. In March of 1863, a male child was born on a tenant farm in Evijärvi in southern Ostrobothnia. When his parents fell victim to the Great Hunger a few years later, the child, named Matti, by then 4 years old, was adopted by a family surnamed Pitkäkangas, thus rebranding him Matti Pitkäkangas. Matti's original last name has long since been lost to history, as have the identities of his biological parent. As he reached adulthood, Matti's unrestrained ways, including a fondness for liquor and a readiness to wield a puukko knife in a fight, inspired the people of Evijärvi to dub him Hurja Matti, loosely translatable into English as Crazy Matt. Whether driven from Finland by want, drawn to the New World by America fever, exiled from Evijärvi for his rebellious behavior, or some combination thereof, in 1886, 23-year-old Matti Pitkäkangas packed his belongings and traveled to Sweden, where he boarded a ship bound across the muddy pond by way of Liverpool for America. Upon arrival in New York Harbor, with the planned facilities at Ellis Island 6 years from completion, Matti disembarked at the fortress-like Castle Garden Emigrant Depot on the southeast tip of Manhattan Island. Passing through immigration, when asked his name, he replied Matt Hurja, not Matti Pitkäkangas, determined to start his new life in his new home with a new name. Fabricated in France and shipped in pieces to New York for reassembly there, the Statue of Liberty was under construction on Liberty Island when Matti's ship steamed by it on the way to Castle Garden. Traveling west, Matt settled in the iron ore mining boomtown of Crystal Falls on Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Well into the 19th century, the UP had lingered as the last remaining undeveloped stretch of American wilderness east of the Mississippi. The region was so far away in people's minds, Patrick Henry once described it as beyond the most distant wilderness and remote as the moon. In 1889, Matt traded vows with Anna Kaisari, not long off the boat from Finland. A year later, they welcomed their first child, Arthur. When their second child, again a boy, arrived in January of 1892, they named him Emil. 10 more children would follow, the last in 1912, a pair of twins, of whom only the firstborn survived a difficult delivery at home. Of the dozen Hurja children, only 7 lived to see the age of 25. Death was a part of Emil's family life from a young age. The iron mines of the UP were among the most dangerous in the world, and those of the Menominee Range where Crystal Falls lay especially so owing to the threat of flooding from the region's many lakes and rivers. Matt soon learned of that sad fact firsthand. In 1890, crouched behind an ore car loaded with more than a ton of freshly mined red hematite, manhandling it down primitive rails toward the main shaft, Matt suffered a crushed left leg beneath a cascade of falling rock. In the absence of quality medical attention, his injuries never properly healed, saddling him with a lifelong daily routine of unbinding his leg, applying salves and rebandaging the wounds. He had open sores on his leg that never really healed, Matt's youngest surviving child, Lilia, recounted years later. Sometimes he flinched when I removed the bandages and applied the salve, but he never once complained. He always smiled and thanked me with a kiss on the forehead. Ever after, Matt relied on a cane and a specially built shoe to walk, refusing to let his injury deter him from supporting his family. He viewed his injury as something one must deal with, and nothing more. Using funds from the settlement he received for his injury, in 1892, Matt opened a dry goods store on Superior Avenue, Crystal Falls' Main Street, embarking on a career as a small business entrepreneur that took several turns, from dry goods store owner to candy shop owner, from insurance agent to travel agent, and more. Demonstrating agility and wits, Matt did whatever was needed to feed and house and clothe his family, and did it well. During the Middle Ages, it was believed that an alchemist could turn iron into gold. Centuries later, enterprising alchemists disguised as businessmen turned iron-rich Upper Peninsula hematite ore into financial gold in the blast furnaces of steelmaking towns such as Gary and Pittsburgh. Youngstown and Cleveland. The total value of the ore extracted from the UP's iron ranges was greater than that of all the coveted yellow metal extracted from the rivers and streams and fields of the Yukon. Wealth built on the labors of immigrant miners like Matt Hurja in locations like those of Crystal Falls and Iron Mountain and Iron River helped fund the development of downstate Michigan while filling the coffers of distant investors who rarely if ever visited the Upper Peninsula unless it was to hunt or fish or sightsee. Most of the wealth the UP generated went elsewhere. Such were the economic and social dynamics of the age and society, a human alchemy that gave rise in the North Country to a distinctive slice of humanity known as Yoopers. A knowledgeable observer once asserted that a Yooper is always a Yooper even if they leave God's country to live somewhere else. Long before the term was coined, Emil was Yooper in spirit and remained so his whole life through, though living elsewhere for nearly 40 years until, in his mid-50s, he reclaimed Crystal Falls as his home when he ran for Congress. Some welcomed him back, others branded him a carpetbagger. Crystal Falls invested a fair share of its cut from its mine's revenues in education, embracing the principles of noted German educator Friedrich Froebel, known as the inventor of kindergarten. Working in Germany in the 1830s and 40s, Froebel recognized that significant brain development occurs in children in their early years. His radical education methods combined an awareness of human physiology with a recognition of creativity as an essential element of our makeup. Play is the highest expression of human development in children, he once wrote, for it alone is the free expression of what is in a child's soul. Froebel further believed that knowledge of mathematics was an essential element in any good education. His approach to education was progressive for its time and inspired other influential educators who followed him, such as John Dewey and Maria Montessori. Modernist architects like Frank Lloyd Wright, Le Corbusier, and Buckminster Fuller were exposed as children to Froebel's ideas about geometry. Thanks to the astuteness of the town's civic leaders, students like Emil and his siblings received as good an education in the remote frontier boomtown of Crystal Falls as did children in that era attending public schools in any town or city in America, boosting its children's prospects. Finland had in Matt's time, and still has today in ours, the highest literacy rate of any country in the world, a testament to the Finnish people's belief in the primacy of education. In towns like Crystal Falls, home to clusters of Finnish immigrants, that belief was reinforced by the varied social and educational programs offered by their local Finn halls. Intellect were forged in a crucible fired by traditions brought to these shores by immigrants from afar. A testament to the motive power of the melting pot that was, is, and one would hope, forever shall be America. Multivarious education, reinforced by his parents' trademark Finnish dedication to literacy and homeschooling, prepared Emil well for the life journey that lay ahead. Being a child of a UP Iron Range boomtown proved for him a blessing. Shortly after graduating from high school in 1909, driven by an unquenchable thirst for adventure, by a preternatural need to explore new frontiers, by wanderlust plain and simple, Emil embarked on what would morph in time into a lifelong quest for a world offering greater opportunities, certain from the outset that he would find it somewhere in the West. Exactly where in the West he wasn't quite sure, but he had an idea: Alaska. An adventurous Finn had visited the Hurja home the year before, on his way to the Yukon goldfields, telling expansive tales of the riches in the far north awaiting those daring enough to pursue them. An enthralled Emil listened and dreamed. The dream persisted. It would take him longer than he had hoped to reach America's last frontier, but when he did, he made the most of his time in a territory once derisively dismissed as Seward's folly. The Hurja family's pastor, J.J. Hurja, was the first Finnish pastor ordained in America. The same Hurja helped found the Suomi Synod Lutheran Church, a Finnish-American denomination emphasizing pastoral leadership and parish education. Typical of Finnish theology, Hurja placed Christian ethics squarely within the context of everyday life. Free from subjective sentimentalism and moralistic casuistry, the Suomi Synod offered a simple living faith guideline to its members. You demonstrated your faith through right actions. Taught and confirmed by Hurja in a Suomi Synod church, Emil reflected those influences when he developed a political philosophy as well as a basic approach to life. Judging from how others described him, he lived life in accordance with those values. In June of 1909, Reverend Hurja joined Matt and Anna at the train station to see Emil off. Moments before the young adventurer boarded the train, Hurja gave him a Finnish copy of the New Testament for moral guidance and a silver dollar for good luck. Emil carried that coin with him for the rest of his life as a treasured keepsake. He also took with him a clearly articulated Finnish identity and the experience of growing up in a mining town barely out of its frontier, settlement, boomtown days. Stopping in Duluth, Minnesota for a spell, for reasons known to him alone, Emil lost his entire grubstake. Penniless yet determined to continue on his westward trek, Emil turned to the only option he could afford, living the life of a hobo, a scissorbill, a bindlestiff, a knight of the road, hopping freight trains and sleeping in the hay racks of cattle cars in the direction of the setting sun. Along the way he obtained an Industrial Workers of the World red card, more out of self-preservation than as a political statement. Many of the men he encountered in boxcars and hobo jungles were card-carrying wobblies. Without a red card to prove his bona fides, Emil ran the risk of being tossed off trains or being banned from jungles. Prudence dictated he join the wobblies' ranks, on paper if not in politics. Travel by rail and wolfing mulligan in hobo jungles, the melting pot of trampdom in one scholar's words, was a way of life for an estimated 700,000 homeless transients in that bygone era. Their off-the-grid world operated as its own distinctive, rough-hewn egalitarian democracy with a generally accepted set of rules, a union, and an ad hoc judicial system to help assure a modicum of law and order in the jungles and boxcars and rail yards of America. Migratory workers such as these in pre-World War I America viewed themselves as inheritors of the Western pioneer spirit, as a community of belated frontiersmen opposed to the impersonal regimentation of the modern machine age. Emil's education in the hobo school of life left a lasting impression on him, as much or more so as a degree from an Ivy League college would have done. Emil's westward voyage of discovery landed him for a few months in 1910 in Butte, Montana, promoted by local boosters as the richest hill in the world, where wages were reportedly much higher than on the UP, owing to a severe labor shortage. Rather than working in a local mine, however, Emil got by delivering groceries for a sympathetic store owner, much like he had done working for his father in his growing up years in Crystal Falls. Itching for greater opportunity, Emil hopped aboard a freight train bound for Seattle, living there in a flophouse near Union Station for a few days before retreating back to Yakima in eastern Washington, where he found work as a postal clerk. Returning to Seattle from Yakima in 1911, Emil tarried but briefly, for his ultimate destination remained Alaska, where he remained convinced that a fortune awaited him somewhere in the land of the midnight sun. In Fairbanks, Emil immediately landed a job as a reporter for a local paper, learned to mush a dog sled, and covered a host of notable Alaska events, including the first successful ascent of what was then known as Mount McKinley, since renamed Mount Denali. Remaining in Fairbanks throughout the winter months rather than returning to the lower 48 as most people from down below, dismissively referred to as Chichikos by year-round residents, Emil achieved sourdough status, a label he wore with pride. College for Gold Rush Alaskans usually meant schooling at the University of Washington in Seattle. By special agreement, Washington admitted Alaska residents without requiring them to take an entrance exam. Leaving Alaska behind for the moment, deciding to pursue a college education after all, in 1913 Emil caught a steamer south through the Inland Passage to Puget Sound to begin a new chapter in his life. Every summer for the next 4 years, Emil returned to Alaska working as a journalist authoring articles about Alaska for various publications. In one such piece, appearing in the conservation-minded Overland Monthly founded by Bret Harte and Jack London's magazine of choice for articles from his pen, Emil predicted that Alaska would soon become the center of meat production for North America through the wise harvesting of its reindeer herds. To see millions of reindeer feeding on the tundra of central and northern Alaska, he wrote, to see trains and shiploads of reindeer carcasses moving southward to the Puget Sound ports, thence to be distributed to the people of the West, to see the people clamoring for the cheaper reindeer meat in preference to the high-priced cuts of beef, all will be common sights within another 5 years. That is the opinion of those Alaskans who have studied the question of meat supply and are conversant with the reindeer industry in the North, as it has been carried on for the past decade. Emil's powers of prognostication in the matter of reindeer meat proved sadly lacking. Working part-time as a reporter for the Seattle Post-Intelligencer to help pay for his education, Emil covered a speech at the local Finnish socialist hall by anarchist firebrand Emma Goldman. The hobo, he quoted Goldman as saying, is a man to be envied, as he has the courage to resist the machine that would rob him of his birthright. He rides in a boxcar but is as honorable a globetrotter as he who rides in a private car. Once again, as with wobblies he had encountered in boxcars and hobo jungles, Emil found himself agreeing with select sentiments of others whose politics were not in harmony with his own. In June of 1914, reporting again for the PI, Emil covered that year's commencement address delivered by the era's leading historian of the American West, Frederick Jackson Turner, father of the frontier thesis interpretation of American history. The typewritten manuscript for Turner's speech has been preserved in the archives of the University of Washington, adorned with an abundance of handwritten corrections and deletions scribbled by Turner himself. The manuscript is chock full of sentiments and observations that later appeared as important elements in Emil's approach to history and, by extension, to his take on the art and science of public opinion polling. American democracy was born of no theorist's dream. It was not carried in the Susan Constant to Virginia, nor in the Mayflower to Plymouth. It came stark and strong and full of life out of the American forest, and it gained new strength each time it touched a new frontier. The history of the American people, Turner argued, forces upon our attention the fact that no satisfactory understanding of the evolution of this people is possible without calling into cooperation many sciences and methods, hitherto but little used by the American historian. Data drawn from studies of literature and art, politics, economics, sociology, psychology, biology, and physiology, all must be used. The method of the statistician, as well as that of the critic of evidence, is absolutely essential. We need a political history of the United States, Turner continued, which shall penetrate beneath the surface of the proceedings of national conventions to the study of the evolution of the organs of party action and of those underlying social and economic influences in the states and sections which explain party action. We need to give a social and economic interpretation to the history of political parties in this country. When such a study of our party development shall have been made, we shall be in a better position to comprehend the laws that determine party action in general, and an important contribution will have been made to the understanding of the development of society. On his journey west on a Great Northern train from Madison, Wisconsin to Seattle, Turner listened intently to an immigrant's effusive words that captured well the spirit of adventure infecting Emil and so many other young dreamers like him who believed in America as a place where all things were possible to people like themselves, through determined effort with a spot of luck. "Why should I not love Seattle?" the man asked Turner rhetorically. "It took me from the slums of the Atlantic coast, a poor Swedish boy with hardly $15 in my pocket. It gave me a home by the bountiful sea. It spread before my eyes a vision of snow-covered peaks and smiling fields. It brought abundance and a new life to me and my children, and I love it. I love it. If I were a multi-millionaire, I would charter freight cars and carry away from the crowded tenements and noisome alleys of the eastern cities and the old world the toiling masses, and let them loose in our vast forests and ore-laden mountains to learn what life really is." Emil spent a considerable portion of his early adult years in those very forests and ore-laden mountains. What they taught him about life stayed with him to the very end. Later that summer, Emil traveled to the Klondike together with a recent graduate of the University of Denver, Lowell Thomas, whom he had met by chance in Seattle. A fledgling journalist on a fast track to global fame, Thomas was making his first trip outside the contiguous lower 48 states. The newly minted friends arrived in Dawson City, Yukon Territory on a fateful day in history, Sunday, the 1st of August 1914. While checking for mail at the offices of the Dawson Daily News, the two men learned via the telegraph wire of startling developments in Europe. With no pressmen or typesetters at work on a Sunday, they wrote the story, set the type, and ran the presses on an extra edition announcing to the denizens of the Yukon Territory that war had broken out in Europe. By 1917, travel to the U.S. by foreign visitors had fallen to near zero owing to the war. Seeking to compensate for the lost revenue, Secretary of the Interior Franklin Lane launched a search for someone to write stories encouraging Americans to travel more at home. Emil recommended Thomas. When America entered the war, Lane redirected Thomas to Europe, refused access to the Western Front by French and British authorities fearful he might tell readers the truth. Thomas diverted to Arabia, where he hooked up with a young British Army officer named T.E. Lawrence, who was deeply involved in the Arab revolt against Ottoman rule. In a roundabout way, an introduction by Emil indirectly led through Thomas to the birth of the legend of Lawrence of Arabia. 40 years after discovering Lawrence, Thomas launched the short-lived cinematic phenomenon, Cinerama. Emil had traveled north to Alaska in search of gold. Returning south to Seattle, he struck a gold streak of another kind in the person of Gudrun Anderson. In time, Emil and Goody would become a power couple in Washington, D.C. decades before it was recognized that there was such a thing. By her account, and contrary to the self-serving claims of others, Goody was the first white child to settle in Dawson City following the discovery of gold on Bonanza Creek. where her father was one of the few prospectors who actually struck it rich. Something like 19 and 20 adventurers who traveled to the Klondike in search of gold went bust, creating a plethora of homeless, penniless men with nowhere to go and little to eat. In the face of widespread misery, the citizenry of Dawson City banded together to raise money in a host of ways to help legions of unfortunate souls. A golden-tressed tyke who occasionally performed at such fundraisers was young Goody. Keeping the peace in the Yukon in those challenging times were members of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Adopting her as one of their own and sponsoring her performances, the Mounties declared Goody the pet of the Northwest Mounted Police. Her other nickname was the Little Sweetheart of the Yukon. One notable fundraiser held in Dawson City featured folk heroine Martha Jane Canary, better known by her stage name Calamity Jane, performing her sharpshooting tricks on stage. Calamity's performance was followed by the reading of his poem, The Cremation of Sam McGee, by Robert Service, popularly known as the Bard of the Yukon. There are strange things done in the midnight sun, by the men who moil for gold. The Arctic trails have their secret tales, that would make your blood run cold. The Northern Lights have seen queer sights, but the queerest they ever did see was that night on the marge of Lake LaBarge. I cremated Sam McGee. When Goody's turn came to perform, accompanying herself on the piano, she warbled in a soft, clear soprano voice the lyrics from that most maudlin of maudlin songs, A Bird in a Gilded Cage. She's only a bird in a gilded cage, a beautiful sight to see. You may think she's happy and free from care, she's not, though she seems to be. 'Tis sad when you think of her wasted life, for youth cannot mate with age, and her beauty was sold for an old man's gold. She's a bird in a gilded cage. As the year 1915 progressed and the war in Europe raged unabated with no sign of ending anytime soon, calls for peace arose from many quarters, one of them the headquarters building of the Ford Motor Company in Dearborn, Michigan. In far-off Seattle, Emil heard the voice of the most famous of all Michiganders cry out and hastened to join him on one of history's most extraordinary failed crusades. Earlier that year, automobile titan Henry Ford, famous for his pacifist sentiments, had pledged his fortune to the cause of peace. As winter neared, he announced a plan to personally lead an expedition to Europe to get the boys out of the trenches by Christmas. Appointed by UW President Henry Suzzalo to represent Washington, Emil sped east in a heated coach compartment, fare paid, not in an unheated boxcar, as an uninvited guest as had been his wont in recent years. A polyglot collection of characters accepted Ford's invitation, among them suffragette Inez Milholland Boissevain, who had led the 1913 Women's Suffrage Parade in Washington, D.C., wearing a flowing white dress and sitting astride a towering white horse. Emil's exposure to activists such as her stoked his belief in the causes of peace and international cooperation. An editorial Emil wrote for the October 13, 1915 issue of the University of Washington student newspaper The Daily, of which he had been elected editor, titled True Democracy, articulated his political philosophy, clearly reflecting the influence Frederick Jackson Turner had had on him. As a result of the comprehensive, nationwide poll of public opinion recently conducted by the Literary Digest, residents of the Pacific Northwest may take increased pride in the institutions which their section of a great nation sees fit to uphold. Not only do Washington, Oregon, and Idaho stand at the head of the nation as regards statewide prohibition, but also in the much-mooted question of women's suffrage. In matters of reform, the West always takes the lead. Although civilization is moving westward, reform is taking the opposite path. The progressiveness of the West is rapidly encroaching upon the conservatism of the South and East. The readiness with which Westerners reject utopianism, but eagerly search out after any and all things that make for social and political progress, shows that the spirit of democracy is still dominant on the Pacific Coast. Let it be the most sacred tradition of this university that the fires which reflect the warmth of democracy shall never burn low. In need of extra income to pay for his schooling, in February 1917, Emil withdrew on short notice from classes at the University of Washington to accept a position as special correspondent for the Alaska Daily Empire in Juneau. Emil described his new work in a letter to a friend. "I figured that the political situation in Alaska would be very interesting and worthwhile," he wrote. "So I became correspondent for a number of newspapers at the third session of the territorial legislature. It was extremely so, and I enjoyed the month that I spent in Juneau getting the inside track of a lot of territorial petty intrigue." Accepting a surprise offer to serve as secretary to the territory's non-voting member to the House of Representatives, Charles Sulzer, Emil abruptly resigned his position with the Alaska Daily Empire and hastened to the nation's capital as fast as a daisy chain of ships and trains could get him there. arriving in D.C. an hour late to hear President Wilson declare war on Germany before a packed joint session of Congress. In January of 1918, Emil listened in person from a perch in the wings of the House of Representatives a few feet away from the Speaker's dais as Woodrow Wilson presented his plan for peace in Europe in his famous 14-point speech. Later, he noted how eerily they mimicked the main talking points espoused by him and his fellow peace ship delegates 2 years before. Casting his pacifist peace ship persona aside, when the U.S. entered the war, Emil lobbied everyone of importance he knew from Washington, D.C. to Washington State to Alaska in pursuit of a commission in the Army, crossing his fingers it would involve aviation in some way. His efforts were rewarded with an appointment to the U.S. Army Signal Corps, under whose wing, absent a separate air force, flew the planes of America's military. Owing to his extensive knowledge of the Pacific Northwest lumber industry gained from his years spent living in the region and reporting on its economy, Emil was assigned to what was labeled the Spruce Production Division, whose brief was to protect, support, and expand the harvesting of Sitka spruce, the finest material to be found anywhere for building airplanes. A powerful motivating force behind the creation of the Spruce Production Division was a widespread fear that the harvesting of spruce might otherwise be sabotaged by disaffected Wobblies and clandestine German agents intent on undermining the war effort. The daunting terrain where the coveted spruce grew and the underdeveloped to non-existent transportation infrastructure accessing it posed huge challenges to harvesting operations. A salient factor in the founding and initial success of the Boeing Company was its factory's close proximity to the world's foremost supply of the most critical material needed for building airplanes in those pre-aluminum days. The benefits of favorable geography gave William Boeing a major leg up on his competitors at the birth of an industry his company would go on to dominate for nearly a century. Emil's close proximity to the rise of Boeing helped ignite his own lifelong passion for aviation. As the Big Four, Woodrow Wilson from the U.S., Lloyd George from Great Britain, Georges Clemenceau from France, and Vittorio Orlando from Italy met at Versailles to negotiate a treaty formally concluding what people by then were calling the Great War, Emil and Goody entered the most impactful year yet of their young lives. Continuing to loom over everyday life was the Spanish flu. Neither Emil nor Goody, nor anyone in Emil's family had come down with it, but it would contribute to the death of Goody's mother the following year. Searing labor unrest in Seattle led in 1919 to the outbreak of the only general strike in American history to shut down an entire city. A prominent voice on behalf of the strikers was radical journalist Anna Louise Strong, to whom many point as the first woman street reporter in the history of Seattle newspapers. At the height of the general strike, soldiers set up a machine gun nest directly in front of the entrance to Emil's spruce production office in the Pioneer Building facing Pioneer Square, the city's traditional gathering place for radicals, protesters, Native Americans, and transients. First as a reporter for the Post-Intelligencer, and later as the paper's society editor, Goody had as good a claim as Strong to being Seattle's first woman street reporter. In one noteworthy article, Keen Enjoyment Found Sailing About in Air, she described the sensation of flying in an airplane for the first time. There is an extraordinary charm about sailing through the air. It had been with lively curiosity and just a tiny bit of misgiving that I had boarded the waterplane. Now the latter feeling had turned into the keenest enthusiasm. One flies with the exhilarating assurance that there is nothing to run over or into, except perhaps the land and the lake. However, one seems to imbibe the feelings of a sort of ethereal thing, away up there, overcoming the elemental materials like land and water, as things apart from such an ideal state. The world under you is a perfect blur at first, but as you rise, the objects become more distinct. As for dizziness, one feels it not at all. Upon his discharge from military service, they married in June in a church across the street from the University of Washington. Rusty Callow, captain of the UW's men's crew, served as Emil's best man while his wife-to-be Dolly served as Goody's maid of honor. Taking a steamship to Southern California, the newlyweds set themselves up for an extended honeymoon stay at the Hotel del Coronado on the Pacific coast west of San Diego. While staying at the Del, the couple visited the home of publisher E.W. Scripps. That connection led to their developing a long association with Scripps' eventual successor, Roy Howard, founder of United Press and later head of the Scripps-Howard chain of newspapers. 40 years later, the Del served as a key setting for Billy Wilder's classic comedy film, Some Like It Hot, starring Marilyn Monroe, Tony Curtis, and Jack Lemmon. The movie's tagline read, "Not since Scarface so much action, not since the Marx Brothers so much comedy, not since the 7-Year Itch so much Marilyn." Gudrun's father, Anders Anderson, had extensive oil investments in Texas and used his Lone Star connections to introduce his new son-in-law to leading business people there. With his blessing, in September of 1919, Emil and Goody betook themselves to the Wild West reborn precincts of Texas, set themselves up in Fort Worth, and began exploring the sundry opportunities offered adventurous souls like themselves in a land overflowing with an abundance of black gold. With the help of a local oil millionaire who had previously dabbled in gold mines in Alaska, Emil bought a modest, 4-page, tabloid-style daily newspaper, the Breckenridge American, with a circulation of just under 3,000, and set about reporting on the goings-on in a rip-roaring wild town, living with Goody in a lean-to shed in the back of the newspaper's combination office and printing plant. His first news story reportedly centered on 2 corpses he found bedecking a saloon's billiards table after a deadly gunfight. A few months later, a heavily inebriated citizen showed up at the American's doorstep one evening, waving a pistol and demanding to know the whereabouts of the editor, whom he intended to shoot for penning an offensive piece regarding the disposal of a nearby ball-yard. Emil informed the man that he had come to the wrong place and directed him to another address, locking the front door behind the visitor and making a hasty exit out the back. He was crazy and drunk enough to shoot somebody, Emil said later. That Christmas, Emil declared in a card to Goody that the past 6 months have been more than replete with happiness. Them's my sentiments. To my honey love, one for each month, your boy. Goody reacted with glee to the ratification of the 19th Amendment granting women the right to vote. In a story published in the Washingtonian 2 years earlier, she expressed her view towards how unfairly women had been treated by a society controlled by men. When a woman throws off the man-made laws and conventions that have enslaved her and hindered her growth, her capabilities in science, yes, and in every field of human endeavor, are infinite. Goody devoted her entire life, to the end, to proving her point. Come 1920, Emil attended the Democratic National Convention in San Francisco as a delegate from the territory of Alaska when Governor James Cox of Ohio won his party's nomination for president, and a brash former Undersecretary of the Navy named Franklin Delano Roosevelt joined him on the ticket as the Dems nominee for vice president, supported by Emil's vote. 12 years later, following FDR's nomination for the presidency in Chicago, his handlers gauged the stock of favor seekers and aspiring appointees by whether or not they had been FRBC, standing for Roosevelt, before Chicago. By that measure, Emil passed the test with flying colors. I have been here since December 1st, Emil wrote to a friend from Breckenridge in 1921, but am now looking about for other things, now that the boom has subsided. I'm out after the golden fleece while in Texas, and I'm hopeful of finding it here before conditions in the north compel my return there. When I get a chance, I'll sell out and return to the Pacific Northwest or Alaska. The climate is against my grain, and the wife simply cannot stand it here another year or two. 300 or so miles northeast of Breckenridge in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the single most deadly race riot in American history decimated what had been a flourishing black community, destroying lives, scarring the souls of survivors, and challenging Emil's romanticized notion of the frontier's promise. Despite whatever complaints she may have voiced, Goody had her light-hearted moments in Breckenridge, like the time she composed doggerel exulting in her status. A wealthy oil king's wife am I, just watch my speed as I whiz by. The faster the oil spurts from the spout, the faster my page wheels fly about. In 1922, the Breckenridge American ran ads for the local movie theater promoting a terrifying new movie from out of Germany, Nosferatu. Seeking a watery escape from Sagebrush, Texas on the bounding Main, Goody took an extended cruise to South America in 1922. 2 years past the newlywed stage in their marriage and obviously missing his bride, Emil wrote to her about driving through the Texas countryside in her high-flying page, closing the typewritten missive with a column of 15 flush-left I love yous separated by carriage returns. That September, 4 miles east of Breckenridge, an oil well that was being drilled blew in, shooting oil and salt water for days downwind as far as 2.5 miles away, drenching everything in its path. It took 2 weeks to harness the runaway geyser. Writing for the American as she sometimes did, Goody described the scene with her customary literary flourish. The picture is enhanced by the romantic setting in which it is cast. Hollows and ravines and wooded hills in the background catch flickering glare of the fires and sway to its rhythmical rise and fall, while the glistening white salt which surrounds the pit scintillates. In 1923, a 450-foot-long sign with 50-foot-high letters reading Hollywoodland was erected above Beechwood Canyon in the Santa Monica Mountains to promote a housing development. Today that sign lives on in shortened form as the iconic symbol of Hollywood known the world over. Succumbing to the allure of Southern California that same year, Emil and Goody relocated from Breckenridge to Beverly Hills, from where he ran a string of local weekly newspapers while she dabbled in real estate speculation. In today's business vernacular, Goody's efforts would best be described as flipping houses, drawn to aviation like a moth to the summer lantern's glow. The following year, Emil covered the arrival of 2 planes of the U.S. Army Air Service as they neared completion of the first circumnavigation of the globe by air. Joining Emil that day at the airport in Santa Monica, along with a welcoming crowd of at least 100,000 people, was his sidekick from his Alaska travels, Lowell Thomas. In the November 1924 presidential election, Republican Calvin Coolidge soundly defeated Democrat John W. Davis. A significant slice of the electorate cast its vote neither for Coolidge nor Davis but for progressive presidential candidate Robert M. La Follette of Wisconsin and his VP running mate Burton K. Wheeler of Montana. Emil first met Wheeler, a fiercely independent, frontier-bred political force of nature, difficult to pigeonhole as a politician, a thinker, and a person. In 1910, during his brief sojourn in Butte, Montana on his way to Alaska, the 2 men remained close friends over the course of a market crash, a Great Depression, and 2 world wars. At Christmas time 1925, in Italy, where a rabble-rousing political journalist named Benito Amilcare Andrea Mussolini had assumed the presidency 3 years earlier with a promise to the Italian people to make the trains run on time, Il Duce was given a new title, head of government, solidifying his power as dictator of an emerging fascist state. In July of 25, in a courtroom in a small town in Tennessee, a high school teacher, John T. Scopes, was put on trial for teaching the theory of evolution in a state-funded school. Known as the Scopes Monkey Trial, the case gained nationwide attention, including in the Hurja home out west in Beverly Hills. Both Emil and Goody had taken Professor Trevor Kincaid. 10 years earlier, Goody had described Kincaid, one of the academic all-stars on the Washington faculty, in her usual colorful way. Trevor Kincaid boasts that his ancestors were wild Irish and lived in sod houses and were not acquainted with the toothbrush. Decidedly, he is not a tailor's man. He has a disastrous habit of carrying chalk in his pockets. His eyes are blue-gray and their twinkle is a vestige of the wild Irish in him. When he comes to evolution, you feel that somewhere nearby there is lurking the wild man from Borneo, and before he is through, you are sure that all of us came from our brother the monkey. Heeding the call of a hungry heart, in 1926, Emil sold his chain of weekly newspapers and moved on. Intrigued by rumors of opportunities in Cuba, Emil and Goody traveled to Havana that April with members of the Florida State Hotel Association. The group was welcomed in a special ceremony at the presidential palace by Cuban President Gerardo Machado A. Morales. That September, shortly after Emil and Goody relocated to Miami with their hearts and eyes fixed on Cuba, the Great Florida Hurricane of 1926 struck their temporary beachfront hotel home dead center. The storm leveled much of the city, killing crowds of people who, thinking it was safe, walked outside when the calm air of the eye passed over them, only to be swept away when its fury returned in greater force. In a single day, courtesy of one horrific storm, the Florida land boom of the 20s was swept away and many an investor's fortune with it. Pointing to the overheated speculation it embodied, some view that cataclysm as a prequel to the stock market crash that followed 3 years later. In an eerie coincidence of time and place, Emil and Goody witnessed both disasters firsthand. In Miami, they hunkered down in their hotel and watched in horror as their latest pipe dream came crashing down around them. By year's end, in search of new opportunities elsewhere, the doughty pair resettled in the greatest roaring 20s boomtown of them all, New York City. With the stock market's rise accelerating at a dizzying pace, Emil put his talents as a financial analyst to work advising a bevy of prominent clients, among them John Jacob Raskob, founder of General Motors, Joseph Kennedy, ruthless speculator and father of famous politicians, and Bernard Selim Ben Smith, the most successful and colorful of all the so-called bear raiders of the age. Almost in caricature, Smith wore a pirate-like black patch over his right eye, having lost his starboard orb in a scuffle during a rough-and-tumble youth. The highlight of the year 1927 came when Charles Lindbergh, Lucky Lindy, completed the first solo nonstop flight across the Atlantic Ocean from the U.S. to France. The feat instantly made Lindbergh a national hero. It caught Emil's attention as well, inspiring another transatlantic first a decade later personally orchestrated by him. Putting to use thespian skills honed on the stages of Dawson City and the University of Washington, Goody joined Eva Le Gallienne's Civic Repertory Theater troupe as an understudy, performing in the stage Doyen's legendary 1928 production of Peter Pan. With Le Gallienne playing the title role, Peter Pan flew over astonished audiences suspended from a high wire for the first time in theatrical history. 1928 found movie theaters running a 7-minute featurette Steamboat Willie, incorporating sound with animation for the first time and starring a delightful new cartoon character created by a Hollywood upstart named Walt Disney. Disney's character's name? Mickey Mouse. That same year, Emil attempted his first serious foray into presidential politics, offering his polling services to the Democratic National Committee, who turned him away. In the wake of Al Smith's loss to Herbert Hoover, Emil argued that Smith would have won had a small number of votes in a few key states swung to the Democratic side. The Democrats, he reasoned, ought to have lavished their money on the few states that mattered, states like West Virginia, states where they had a clear shot at winning. Had his offer of assistance been accepted and the attendant advice followed, Herbert Hoover would never have slept a single night in the White House. When the stock market suffered a precipitous fall on Black Thursday, October 24, 1929, Emil was traveling in Canada inspecting gold mines with Ben Smith. Rushing back to the Big Apple, Smith stormed into his office on Monday morning, the 28th, known as Black Monday, and instructed his brokers at the top of his lungs to sell them all. Hell, they're worthless anyway. The next day, Black Tuesday, the market suffered its ultimate collapse. In recognition of that moment, reporters nicknamed him Sell 'em Ben Smith. Smith is said to have made a fortune short-selling that week, thumbing his nose at the advice of countless financiers and bankers who were frantically trying to shore up the market. Some people at the time accused Smith of personally causing the market's ultimate collapse. Such was the supposed impact of his voluminous short sells at that critical moment in history. A moment Emil witnessed firsthand and never forgot. The stock market crash of 1929 set in motion a series of events that will end the social landscape of America forever. It would also see the rise of an obscure son of Finnish immigrants from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan to the uppermost reaches of the New Deal leadership as sourdough Emil transformed himself into the Wizard of Washington.